In 1945, the Pacific War had devolved into a horrific struggle for both the Americans and the Japanese. American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands, and the Japanese military, facing what seemed like inevitable defeat, embraced increasingly extreme and desperate tactics. Among these was the widespread use of kamikaze attacks. These were essentially suicide missions in which Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their explosive-laden aircraft into American ships, trading their lives for the chance to sink or cripple vessels that symbolized America's overwhelming naval power. The word kamikaze itself meant divine wind in Japanese, a reference to the legendary typhoons that had annihilated Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. The Japanese military fervently hoped that these modern divine winds, in the form of suicide pilots, would similarly devastate the American invasion force and save Japan from conquest. For American sailors serving on those ships in the Pacific, kamikaze attacks presented a uniquely terrifying kind of threat. Unlike conventional attacks that could be evaded or shot down, a kamikaze pilot only needed to get close enough to crash into a ship. Even if the pilot was killed, the aircraft, now a guided missile, would continue on its deadly trajectory and could still hit its target. To stop a kamikaze, you had to destroy it completely at a distance, not just damage it or drive it away. The USS Bunker Hill was one of the U.S. Navy's Essex-class aircraft carriers, massive ships that displaced over 27,000 tons. These floating airfields carried air wings of nearly 100 aircraft, projecting American power across the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Commissioned in May 1943, the Bunker Hill had participated in numerous major operations, including the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the invasion of the Philippines, and the assault on Iwo Jima. The ship had earned a solid reputation as an effective and well-run vessel with an experienced crew and a combat record that included shooting down scores of enemy aircraft and supporting countless amphibious landings. By May 1945, the Bunker Hill was operating off Okinawa as part of Task Force 58, the main American carrier strike force. The carriers were providing crucial air support for the invasion of that strategically important island, while also defending against the massive waves of kamikaze attacks that the Japanese were unleashing. These operations were called kikusui, or floating chrysanthemums, a poetic euphemism for a strategy designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers and suicidal sacrifice. On the morning of May 11, 1945, the Bunker Hill was engaged in flight operations about 70 miles off the coast of Okinawa. The crew was launching and recovering aircraft in support of ground operations on the island, and also flying combat air patrols to protect the fleet from Japanese air attacks. The ship's crew was at general quarters, meaning all combat stations were fully manned, and everyone was ready for immediate action. Kamikaze attacks had been a constant threat for weeks, and constant vigilance was absolutely essential. The carrier's combat air patrol, fighter aircraft circling high above the fleet to intercept incoming Japanese planes, was maintaining its station. The ship's radar operators were carefully monitoring their screens for any sign of approaching enemy aircraft. It seemed like it would be just another routine day of combat operations in a war that was clearly winding down, but that remained deadly dangerous for everyone involved. At approximately 10 a.m., a lone Japanese Zero fighter aircraft suddenly emerged from cloud cover at high altitude and dove directly toward the Bunker Hill at tremendous speed. The Zero evaded the combat air patrol and approached so quickly that the carrier's anti-aircraft gunners had only seconds to react. The Zero was piloted by a kamikaze volunteer who had specifically targeted American carriers, fully understanding that sinking or crippling one of these massive ships would be a significant blow to American operations and a worthy sacrifice of his life in service to the Emperor. The carrier's 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with tracers and explosive shells. They hit the Zero multiple times and set it on fire. But the aircraft continued its relentless dive and crashed directly into the Bunker Hill's flight deck just aft of the forward elevator, smashing through the wooden deck and exploding inside the hangar bay where numerous aircraft were being fueled and armed for the next strike mission. The explosion was catastrophic. It detonated aviation fuel and ordnance that had been loaded onto the aircraft in the hangar bay, creating a massive fireball that instantly swept through the enclosed space, killing dozens of men and igniting raging fires throughout the forward section of the ship. But the disaster was only just beginning. Less than 30 seconds after the first Zero hit, a second kamikaze aircraft, a duty dive bomber that had followed the Zero down using the same cloud cover, crashed into the Bunker Hill's flight deck near the base of the island superstructure, the command and control center of the ship. This second impact and explosion killed or wounded virtually everyone in the carrier's primary flight control station. It knocked out critical communications equipment, ignited more fires on the flight deck where numerous aircraft were parked awaiting launch, and created a second raging inferno that began spreading rapidly through the ship's superstructure. Within mere minutes of the two impacts, the USS Bunker Hill had been transformed from an efficient fighting ship into a floating catastrophe, with massive fires raging both in the hangar bay and on the flight deck. Hundreds of men were dead or wounded. Command and control were severely disrupted as senior officers were killed or incapacitated, and thick black smoke billowed from the ship, visible for dozens of miles. There was a very real possibility that the fires would spread to the ship's magazines where bombs and torpedoes were stored, or would reach the aviation fuel tanks, or would compromise the structural integrity of the ship to the point where it would capsize or break apart and sink. The two kamikaze hits had killed 346 men immediately and wounded another 264, making this one of the most deadly single attacks on an American ship during the entire Pacific War. As the fires continued to spread and intensify, it seemed entirely possible that the casualty count would rise dramatically higher as the ship was consumed by flames and either sank or had to be abandoned in the chaos and confusion following the kamikaze strikes. As damage control parties rushed to fight the fires, and as wounded men were evacuated to areas of the ship that were still safe, and as officers tried desperately to assess the damage and coordinate response efforts, the situation deteriorated rapidly in ways that seriously threatened the ship's survival. The fires in the hangar bay were being fueled by aviation fuel that was pouring from ruptured fuel lines and from damaged aircraft, creating pools of burning liquid that spread across the hangar deck and dripped down into lower levels of the ship, igniting new fires in compartments below the hangar bay. The fires on the flight deck were being fed by the wooden deck itself, which, despite being treated with fire-retardant materials, was still combustible, and by the numerous aircraft parked on deck that contained fuel and ammunition and that exploded periodically as the fires reached their fuel tanks or ordnance, sending shrapnel and burning debris across the deck and into the air and starting new fires wherever this debris landed. The ship's firefighting systems were partially disabled by the explosions and fires, with water mains ruptured and pumps damaged and hoses burned through, making it extremely difficult to get adequate water pressure to the areas where fires were raging most intensely. The thick smoke that filled many compartments made it nearly impossible for damage control parties to see what they were doing or to breathe without protective equipment that was in short supply. The extreme heat from the fires made it difficult to approach close enough to actually fight the flames effectively. Men were passing out from smoke inhalation or heat exhaustion. Equipment was melting or catching fire. Every minute that passed seemed to make the situation worse rather than better as fires spread faster than they could be contained. Among the hundreds of sailors fighting desperately to save their ship was Seaman First Class Joseph McCaffrey, a 21-year-old from Pittsburgh. McCaffrey had been serving on the Bunker Hill for 18 months and had survived the kamikaze attacks only because he had been in a damage control locker below the hangar deck when the planes hit. McCaffrey was not an officer or a damage control specialist or anyone with particular authority or expertise, just an ordinary sailor assigned to a damage control party whose job was simply to follow orders and help fight fires or repair damage wherever he was sent. In the immediate aftermath of the kamikaze hits, McCaffrey's damage control party had been ordered to the hangar bay to fight the fires there. But when they arrived, they found the situation so chaotic and the fires so intense that their efforts seemed futile, like trying to put out a volcano with garden hoses. Several men in the party were quickly overcome by smoke or driven back by heat before they could accomplish anything meaningful. As McCaffrey and his shipmates struggled to fight the fires in the hangar bay, they became aware of a new and potentially catastrophic problem that was developing in one of the ship's lower compartments. Water was accumulating at an alarming rate in one of the forward storage spaces below the waterline, several decks down from where the fires were raging. This water was creating a serious list, as the ship began to tilt precariously to one side under the weight of hundreds of tons of seawater. The source of the water was not immediately clear. It could have been from ruptured fire mains, or from hull damage caused by the explosions, or from seawater that had been used to fight fires and had drained down into lower compartments through damaged hatches and passages. But regardless of the source, the effect was extremely dangerous, because if the list became too severe, the ship would become unstable and could capsize, particularly if water continued to accumulate on one side while fires burned through structural supports on the other side. The standard procedure for dealing with flooding in ship compartments was to pump the water out using the ship's pumping systems. But many of these systems were damaged or disabled by the kamikaze attacks and fires, and the pumps that were still working were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of water that needed to be moved and by the number of different areas that were flooding simultaneously. Engineers reported that even with all available pumps running at maximum capacity, they could not keep up with the water accumulation in the forward storage space, that the list was continuing to worsen, and that if something was not done soon to either stop the water from entering or to remove it faster than it was accumulating, the ship would likely capsize within the next few hours, sending over 3,000 men into the ocean and adding the Bunker Hill to the growing list of American carriers that had been sunk by Japanese attacks. Officers and senior enlisted men desperately tried to figure out solutions to the flooding problem, discussing technical options like sealing off compartments or rerouting pumping systems, or deliberately flooding spaces on the opposite side of the ship to counteract the list. But every proposal seemed to have serious drawbacks, or would take too much time to implement, or required equipment and personnel that were simply not available because they were already committed to fighting the fires that remained the ship's most immediate and pressing threat. As these discussions continued, and as the ship's list continued to worsen, Joseph McCaffrey, who had been listening to the officers talk while continuing to work on firefighting efforts, made a suggestion that seemed so incredibly simple and so obvious that at first everyone assumed it could not possibly work and dismissed it as the desperate idea of someone who did not truly understand the immense scale of the problem. McCaffrey's idea was this: organize bucket brigades to manually bail out the flooded compartment. Using buckets passed hand-to-hand by lines of sailors to move water from the flooded space up through several decks and out through doors or hatches where it could then be dumped overboard. It was a method that had been commonly used on sailing ships centuries earlier, back when mechanical pumps simply did not exist or had failed. A technique so primitive and seemingly inadequate that using it on a modern aircraft carrier seemed utterly absurd, like trying to empty a swimming pool with a teaspoon. The officers who initially heard McCaffrey's suggestion responded with dismissive comments about how bucket brigades were certainly not a viable solution for serious flooding on a ship this size, how there was far too much water for manual bailing to make any meaningful difference, how they needed sophisticated engineering solutions, not manual labor solutions. McCaffrey was then told to simply focus on his assigned firefighting duties and leave the flooding problem to people who actually understood ship damage control. But McCaffrey persisted in arguing for his idea, pointing out that while mechanical pumps were theoretically more efficient, they were currently unavailable or not working properly, and that anything was definitely better than nothing. He argued that even if bucket brigades could not completely solve the flooding problem, they might still be able to slow the water accumulation enough to buy valuable time for engineers to get more pumps working or to implement other solutions. Furthermore, he emphasized that there were hundreds of sailors on the ship who were not currently engaged in critical tasks, and who could be efficiently organized into bucket brigade lines if officers would simply give the order. His persistence was admittedly annoying to officers who were simultaneously dealing with multiple crises, and who certainly did not have the time to argue with a junior enlisted man about seemingly impractical suggestions. But one officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Williams, who was coordinating damage control efforts in that particular section of the ship, finally decided that McCaffrey's idea might actually be worth trying, simply because no one had any better immediate solutions and because the flooding situation was becoming so desperate that even an improbable solution was worth attempting. Williams then organized several bucket brigades, using sailors who had been evacuated from their normal duty stations because of fires, or who were waiting for equipment or orders, or who were simply available and willing to do anything they could to help save their ship. Lines of men were formed from the flooded compartment up through passageways and ladders to weather decks where water could be dumped overboard, with buckets being passed hand-to-hand from man to man in a continuous chain. Filled buckets moved up, and empty buckets moved down in opposite directions. It was exhausting physical labor, requiring each man to receive a full bucket, pass it to the next man, receive an empty bucket coming back down, pass that to the next man, and repeat this grueling process hundreds or thousands of times without any rest. But the sailors threw themselves into the work with desperate energy, because they fully understood that their ship, and quite possibly their very lives, depended on it. To absolutely everyone's surprise, including Lieutenant Commander Williams, who had authorized the bucket brigades more out of sheer desperation than a genuine expectation that they would actually work, the system began to show tangible results within the very first hour. The water level in the flooded compartment actually stopped rising as rapidly, strongly suggesting that the bucket brigades were now effectively removing water faster than it was accumulating. The ship's list stabilized and then actually began to decrease slightly as water was steadily removed and the weight distribution became more balanced. Engineering reports soon confirmed that the combination of the few working mechanical pumps plus the manual bucket brigades was actually keeping pace with the flooding, removing enough water that the immediate danger of capsizing was significantly reduced. Even though the situation remained undeniably critical and required constant, unrelenting effort to maintain, word spread quickly throughout the ship that the bucket brigades were indeed helping to control the flooding. More and more sailors quickly volunteered to join the lines, or to relieve exhausted men who had been passing buckets continuously for hours. The bucket brigade system rapidly expanded to include hundreds of men working in rotating shifts, with some lines specifically focused on removing water from the flooded forward compartment, while other lines were established to remove water from other areas where firefighting efforts had created accumulations. The simple act of passing buckets became a unifying activity that gave sailors who were not firefighters or technical specialists a meaningful way to actively contribute to saving their ship, transforming feelings of utter helplessness and fear into purposeful action that produced undeniably visible results. Joseph McCaffrey, the ordinary sailor whose supposedly idiotic idea of using bucket brigades had turned out to be a crucial element in the ship's survival, quickly became something of a hero among his shipmates. Officers who had initially dismissed his suggestion began to recognize that sometimes the simplest solutions can be far more effective than complex technical fixes, especially when sophisticated systems are damaged and unavailable. McCaffrey himself continued working tirelessly in the bucket lines for over 12 hours straight, passing buckets until his hands were blistered and his muscles were cramping. He steadfastly refused relief because he felt personally responsible for making sure his idea worked, and because he simply could not ask other men to do work that he himself was unwilling to do. The combination of the firefighting efforts that gradually brought the raging fires under control, and the bucket brigades that successfully managed the dangerous flooding, allowed the USS Bunker Hill to survive the critical first 24 hours after the devastating Kamikaze attacks, the perilous period when the ship was most likely to sink or have to be abandoned. By the morning of May 12, approximately 26 hours after the attacks, the fires were largely extinguished, although some hotspots remained that required constant monitoring. The flooding was under control, with the mechanical pumps now handling most of the water removal, though bucket brigades continued in some areas. The ship was finally stable enough that it could be taken under tow by other vessels and moved away from the immediate combat zone to a location where more extensive repairs could eventually be attempted. The human cost of saving the Bunker Hill was absolutely staggering. The final casualty count was 346 killed and 264 wounded out of a crew of approximately 3,000, making this one of the deadliest attacks on any single American ship during the entire Second World War. Among the dead were many of the ship's senior officers, including the air group commander, and numerous pilots and air crew who had been on the flight deck or in the hangar bay when the Kamikaze struck. The wounded included men with severe burns, blast injuries, smoke inhalation damage, and various other traumatic injuries from the explosions and fires. The ship itself was so heavily damaged that it would never return to combat, requiring months of extensive repairs in port and ultimately being relegated to training duties rather than frontline operations for the remainder of the war. But the Bunker Hill survived, and most of its crew survived. While many factors clearly contributed to this survival, including the extraordinary bravery of the firefighters, the remarkable skill of the damage control parties, and the unwavering determination of officers who steadfastly refused to give up on their ship, the bucket brigades, organized in direct response to Joseph McCaffrey's suggestion, played a measurable and undeniable role in preventing the flooding that could have easily capsized the carrier during those critical first hours when the ship's very fate hung precariously in the balance. The idea that had seemed idiotic when it was first proposed, that had seemed impossibly primitive and woefully inadequate for the sheer scale of the problem, ultimately turned out to be exactly what was needed in a desperate situation where sophisticated systems were unavailable and where human effort and determination could effectively substitute for mechanical efficiency. The story of the bucket brigades on the Bunker Hill became well known throughout the Navy and was regularly used in damage control training and in discussions about creative problem-solving under extreme crisis conditions. The clear lesson drawn was not that bucket brigades should somehow replace mechanical pumps, or that primitive methods were inherently superior to modern systems, but rather that in emergencies when normal systems fail, it is absolutely crucial to consider all available options, including simple manual methods that might initially seem inadequate, but that can ultimately make crucial differences when absolutely nothing else is available. Naval damage control doctrine was subsequently modified to include detailed procedures for organizing bucket brigades and other manual systems as essential backup methods when mechanical systems were disabled. This was a clear recognition that on a ship during combat, anything that efficiently moves water, or effectively fights fires, or rapidly repairs damage can be incredibly valuable, regardless of how simple or old-fashioned the method might seem. Joseph McCaffrey was ultimately awarded the Navy Cross for his actions during the Kamikaze attack and the subsequent damage control efforts. This was a recognition that went far beyond just the bucket brigade idea, acknowledging his sustained physical courage and his unwavering refusal to give up, even when the situation seemed utterly hopeless. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, and noted that his suggestion to use bucket brigades contributed materially to saving the ship at a time when all normal damage control methods had failed or were inadequate. McCaffrey was subsequently promoted and later attended extensive training to become a damage control specialist. He remained in the Navy after the war, eventually retiring after 20 years of distinguished service, with the lasting reputation as the man whose supposedly idiotic idea had remarkably saved one of America's most valuable aircraft carriers. The broader significance of the Bunker Hill incident and McCaffrey's bucket brigade solution extends to fundamental questions about innovation under immense pressure, about the inherent value of listening carefully to ideas from unexpected sources regardless of rank or position, about the crucial importance of maintaining historical knowledge of traditional methods even as technology relentlessly advances, and about the complex relationship between sophisticated technical systems and simple human effort in successfully accomplishing extraordinarily difficult tasks. The bucket brigades worked not because they were inherently better than mechanical pumps, but because they were readily available when the pumps were not. Because they could be rapidly organized and efficiently implemented using resources that were already present on the ship. Because they effectively transformed the crisis from a purely technical problem that only specialists could solve into a collective effort that absolutely anyone could meaningfully contribute to, regardless of their technical expertise. The incident also highlighted just how quickly situations can drastically change in naval combat, and how damage can easily cascade from one system failure to another, creating emergencies that exceed the capacity of any single system or method to adequately address. The Kamikaze attacks created fires that ultimately disabled firefighting systems. The firefighting efforts created flooding that quickly overwhelmed pumping systems. The flooding threatened to capsize the ship, which would have negated all firefighting efforts, creating a vicious cycle of cascading failures that required multiple simultaneous solutions, rather than any single technical fix. In this extremely complex crisis environment, the bucket brigade served not as the sole solution, but rather as one critical element in a comprehensive response that included firefighting and pumping and structural repairs and medical treatment and command decision-making, all of which had to work seamlessly together in order for the ship to ultimately survive. The USS Bunker Hill eventually returned to the United States for extensive repairs and was still undergoing repair when the war finally ended in August 1945. The ship never returned to combat and was officially decommissioned in 1947, having served for just 4 years, but having participated in numerous major operations and having miraculously survived an attack that would have certainly sunk a less well-built ship or a ship with a less determined crew. The carrier was eventually sold for scrap in 1973, but its legacy lived on in the invaluable lessons learned about damage control, and about the critical importance of considering all available methods, no matter how simple or primitive they might initially seem. And in the inspiring story of Joseph McCaffrey, whose willingness to make a suggestion that others initially thought was idiotic ultimately ended up contributing significantly to saving over 2,000 lives and one of America's most valuable military assets. The unrelenting kamikaze threat that nearly destroyed the Bunker Hill continued for the remainder of the war, with over 3,000 kamikaze sorties flown against American ships during the Battle of Okinawa alone, sinking dozens of vessels and severely damaging hundreds more. The The psychological. The impact of facing suicide attacks was enormous, creating a stress and fear among American sailors that was distinct from the stress of conventional combat. There was simply no way to dissuade or deter an enemy who was already planning to die. No way to negotiate or show mercy in a way that might make the enemy less aggressive. The only real defense was to destroy every kamikaze aircraft before it could reach its intended target. And even with the most sophisticated radar systems and massive anti-aircraft firepower, American ships were regularly hit because stopping every single plane in a mass attack was, realistically, next to impossible. Developing effective countermeasures against kamikazes became a top priority for the U.S. Navy. This led to improvements in radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, enhanced combat air patrol procedures, and the deployment of picket ships to provide early warning and to draw attacks away from high-value targets like aircraft carriers. There was also better damage control training and equipment to help ships survive the hits that couldn't be prevented. But throughout the final months of the war, the kamikaze threat remained a serious and deadly one. It was a stark manifestation of Japanese desperation and determination that killed thousands of American sailors and vividly demonstrated the effectiveness of suicide tactics in naval warfare. This was a lesson that would have significant implications for future conflicts, and for military thinking about asymmetric warfare, where technologically inferior forces could still inflict devastating damage through a willingness to accept certain death. The story of Joseph McCaffrey and his bucket brigade solution to the flooding on the Bunker Hill serves as a powerful reminder that in times of crisis, solutions can come from the most unexpected sources and take unexpected forms. It shows that rank and position don't guarantee a monopoly on good ideas, that simple methods can sometimes accomplish what complex systems cannot, and that listening to all suggestions, even those from junior personnel, can occasionally lead to insights that save lives and accomplish missions that would otherwise fail. McCaffrey's story is also a poignant reminder that heroism in warfare isn't just about fighting the enemy. It's about solving problems, about refusing to give up when situations seem utterly hopeless, about trying things that others dismiss as impossible or just plain idiotic, and about the sheer power of collective human effort to accomplish tasks that mechanical systems alone simply can't achieve. The enduring image of hundreds of sailors passing buckets hand to hand through the smoke-filled passages of a burning aircraft carrier, fighting tooth and nail to save their ship through sheer determination and backbreaking physical labor, represents something absolutely essential about the human element in warfare, something that no amount of technology can ever truly replace or render obsolete.